Santana block killer, see that CK right there?
Bompton style.
Welcome to Boys in the Hood TV. Today we're going to discuss the life of OG Mike Loke from the Elm Street Pirus. Now, Mike Loke was born Michael Edwards in 1967 in Compton, California. Now, raised on the east side as a teen, Michael witnessed the early growth of the Pirus and see Luders Park grow into a force. Eventually, most of the older homies from Elm Block will go to jail or join the military, which will leave many of the younger youth, like Mike and others, to fend for themselves against the Crips. Now, some of the younger Elm Street kids, which included OG Louie, who at the time would claim looters, would form their own set called the Elm Street Pirus. Now, some of the older homies from the park weren't too keen on the idea of the Elms, but the Elms had no choice. At the time, Santana Block Crips was right across Santa Fe, and the Elm Street boys were looking like easy pickings. And at the time, Santana Block was extremely deep compared to many Pirus sets, especially Elm Street. So for Elm Street, they had no choice to defend their hood at all costs.
Catch this E, catch this E, see that
Elm Street Pirus.
Santana block killer, see that CK right there? Santana block killer.
Bompton style.
Ham dog, rest in peace. Get this one. Ham dog, rest in peace. And we getting the talents for you, blood.
But they weren't by themselves. Other hoods like the West Side Pirus and the Lime Pirus were back to Elm Street anytime that they needed it. Now, due to the fact that Elm Street Pirus had a smaller hood, they were extra aggressive when it came to beef. And Mike Loke would be one of the most active members from the 356. Now, by the 80s, Mike had become a savage in the streets of Compton, being involved in shootouts and fights with the Santanas and other rival gangs. He had developed a fierce reputation on the streets of Compton to a point to where when he pulled up, people got out of his way. Now, also at this time, the crack era was booming, and a lot of homies from the hood was making hella money. So Mike would join in. But by 1985, Mike's girl would get pregnant, and she would give birth to Mike's baby boy named Trayvon. Now with the child, Mike had to hustle even harder to provide for his family. Now in 1986, while running the streets, Mike would catch a small misdemeanor charge, but this charge would eventually get dismissed. But an opportunity will present itself to Mike and another Elm Street homie named Walker when they got word from another blood named Cash Adams, who had fled to Seattle on a murder charge, that they could set up shop in Seattle and triple their profit. So by late 1986, Mike Loke and Walker were headed to Seattle, Washington. Now, after a few months of watching the local drug dealers in the area, in March of 1987, they set their eyes on a dope spot at the Rainier Valley apartment complex, which was known for high drug activity. Now, after staking this out, both Mike and Walker, both armed with shotguns and pistols, would take aim at the apartment where the local dealers were at. And without saying a word, they start blasting, shooting up the walls, the windows of the apartment complex. And within days, Mike Loke and Walker had took over the apartment complex and set up shop. And over the next few months, they would bring even more Elm Street Pirus over into Seattle to enforce their dominance over anyone who tried to cross them. But word would also reach back to the Crips in LA and in Compton, who would eventually make their way out to Washington. And this would lead to Seattle becoming a war zone for the fight for drug trade.
For drug millions has led two LA gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, to expand to the Northwest, battling for turf in Seattle and Portland.
Now, some gangs like the Rolling 60s and the Hoovers will head over to Tacoma, but gangs like Santana's will make their way to Seattle, exactly where the Elm Streets were at.
I'm Sleebo from Santana. I want all the rules to know. This Compton Crip, CC Riders, and that's all I got to say to them.
Seattle at this point had been taken over by Compton and LA gangs. But in May of 1987, both Mike Loke and Walker will be arrested on multiple charges, including assault and stolen property. But because most of the witnesses had already fled the apartment complex or were too afraid to speak up, the charges were eventually dropped against them. And this would lead to Mike and Walker continue to sell dope in Seattle. Now, Mike, over the next few years, will get arrested on a few minor misdemeanor charges from 87 to 89. Now, by the 90s, Mike Loke will be going back and forth from Seattle to Compton. Mike's rep at this point had preceded him from all that had happened in Seattle. Now, the Elms and Compton were still at war with the Santana blocks with back and forth shootings. But not only were they beefing with Santana, they were also beefing with gangs like Kelly Park and Palm and Oak. But in early '91, Mike Loke would get arrested in Compton on misdemeanor charges for giving LAPD false identification during a traffic stop. But a short time later, Mike would be released back onto the streets. Now, as the war continued in Compton, Mike continued to hustle and make his money. But in 1994, death would come knocking at Mike's door. On December 22nd, just days before Christmas, Mike was out and about at a gas station when allegedly members of the Santana Block Crips would roll up on Mike and shoot and kill him. Mike would be transported to a nearby local hospital where he would be pronounced dead. Now, the loss of Mike Loke will be a big loss to the Elm Street, but the continued wars between the Santana and new rivals will continue to develop on the streets of Compton. I would like to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.